Can everybody see my whole screen now?
Yep, all good.
Great, thanks. All right, I'd like to start by acknowledging that my work is conducted on the lands of the Ngunnawal people, who are the traditional custodians of the Canberra region, and to pay respects to their elders past, present and emerging. So thanks, Francesco, and for everybody for inviting me. For those of you who don't know me, I'm the director of the News and Media Research Centre. Sorry, I put up the wrong screen. Sorry. Okay. I'm the director of the News and Media Research Centre at the University of Canberra, and it's been really lovely over the last couple of years to get to know Selene and Simon and Nicole, and I'm hoping that by sharing some of my research today that we can sort of grow these collaborations. Today I'm going to be introducing the Breaking Silences, Media and the Child Abuse Royal Commission project. That's investigating the role of a changing media in Royal Commissions. I want to try and keep this down to about half an hour. Just first giving a little bit of background to the project, introducing public inquiries and Royal Commissions, because I note that quite a few of your members are from countries other than Australia, and a Royal Commission is a particularly Australian or Commonwealth phenomenon. So I'd like to introduce the phenomenon of a Royal Commission or a Commission of Inquiry. And then I'm just going to give two brief case studies of the early parts of our research. The first one is focusing on the Royal Commission itself as a communicative phenomenon and as an exercise in a national listening exercise. And the second case study I want to give is around a publication that's already been published in Journalism Studies, looking at news media reporting of the Royal Commission. So two facets of the project. You don't have to read the detail here, but this is the website of our project, and you can go on and learn a little bit more about it. Breaking Silences, or one word, .net. So the genesis of the project sits in a series of collaborative research partnerships with 5 female academics in communication and media studies: Tanya Dreyer, Lisa Waller, Christy Hess and Ellie Skogeberg from Oslo. And we've been working together on various projects around changing media and public participation. So this was an opportunity for us to bring our research together to discuss commissions of inquiry in what we refer to as the national conversation. On the project, we're joined by a postdoc, Megan Dees, and Emma John as our PhD candidate. So this was a departure for me from my long association with Indigenous media and policy. But at the time, we were captivated by the intense media scrutiny of the Royal Commission into institutional responses to child sexual abuse that ran from 2013 to 2015. The dramatic nature of the calling of the Royal Commission, the relentless media gaze, the innovative use of digital media and social media engagement meant that this was what we saw as an extraordinary media event that seemed to capture a moment of change in Australia's political and media landscape. Each of us had personal motives for interrogating the issue. For me, it's as a bystander at Marist College, Canberra in the 1980s. At that time, we had no language, no means for unsilencing the abuse that was widely discussed but not made public. I know now that the local news media, police and politicians were complicit in keeping heinous crimes off the public agenda. So as media studies scholars, the team's interest is on news and journalism and the wider media ecology, and how the dramatic changes that were playing out in the industry at the time were affecting this critical conversation. We wanted to investigate not just how journalists reported on the issue in the Royal Commission, but the role of other actors in the mediation process, the Commission itself, the advocacy organisations that use social media tirelessly to raise their issues and to connect with and influence the Royal Commission. Suffice to say, the project was eventually funded, second time round, under an ARC Discovery project, and we started in August last year. So what I'm presenting with you today is fairly early findings. So what's the project doing? It's aiming to examine the role of media and journalism in the Royal Commission into institutional responses to child sex abuse by exploring the nexus between media and commissions of inquiry in the digital era, investigating the impacts of a rapidly changing media environment on this national listening exercise. It's investigating how individuals, affected communities and advocacy organisations at national and local levels use diverse media platforms to connect and have their voices heard in this national critical conversation to shift public understanding of child sex abuse and prevent future institutional failings. We're interested in how the mediated public discourse of the Royal Commission is constructed, sponsored and circulated. So it's a large and complex project. I won't go into the methodology here. Just suffice to say, it takes a case study methodology with the Royal Commission as its case study with a number of underlying cases. But I wanted to just let you, to sort of talk about some of the approaches we've taken. So at the heart is participation with the Royal Commission and with various stakeholders. And I think it's really important to point out that this whole project was underpinned by a close connection with the chair of the Royal Commission, Justice Peter McCallum, who supported the project. He got what we were trying to do and gave us some exceptional access, which I'll talk about in a minute. But I mean, I think, and attending the commission did actually, deepen our understanding and help us to have a very grounded research approach. At the moment, we're in an engagement exercise with all of the advocacy organisations, lawyers, various people who pushed for the Royal Commission and who were intimately engaged in the Royal Commission. We want to know what their ambitions for the project are. We're using archival analysis, secondary analysis of media monitoring, which is one of the case studies I'll talk about today, content and discourse analysis, that's just commencing, that's one of the projects of the PhD, social media analytics, we haven't started that yet, and interviews with Royal Commission staff, journalists and advocacy organisations, and we have ethics to start that part of the project. Okay, so just a little bit about Royal Commissions and the media. The project is actually located in a much bigger sort of body of inquiry around international commissions of inquiry, and what we refer to as a global chain of inquiry about institutional child sexual abuse. But my project is focusing on the Australian Royal Commission. So a Royal Commission represents an opportunity for national level reflection, truth-seeking and public discussion. The calling of a Royal Commission represents a rare opportunity to expose crimes and injustices, enable marginalised voices to be heard, and make recommendations for redress where systems have failed. A Royal Commission is an ad hoc instrument of government appointed at the discretion of executive government under the Royal Commissions Act of 1902. It's a Commonwealth phenomenon, but I'm talking about the Australian manifestation. Each Royal Commission is individually structured in terms of its membership, terms of reference, timeframes and resources to meet the needs of the issue being investigated. I'm drawing a lot on the work of Prasser and Helen Tracy, who say that a Royal Commission is the highest and most prestigious form of public inquiry within the Australian political system. According to Prasser, publicness is a key feature of a Royal Commission. Members are drawn from outside government, they have open processes, seek community input and publicly release their reports and recommendations. Now, look, there's a discussion to be had around why Royal Commissions are called and why we're seeing such an increase in Royal Commissions in the Australian context. Just divert for a second. Kenneth Haynes, the Banking Royal Commissioner, reflected recently that increasingly frequent calls for Royal Commissions in this country cannot and should not be dismissed as some passing fad or fashion. Instead, we need to grapple closely with what these calls are telling us about the state of our democratic institutions. But that's research for another day. All right, so the Royal Commission into Institutional Responses to Child Sexual Abuse, which I'll refer to as the Child Abuse Royal Commission, was called after years of activism by victims and survivor groups, police and church whistleblowers and some journalists to bring the issue to public attention. It was announced in November 2012 by Prime Minister Julia Gillard to examine how institutional systems had failed to protect victims of child sex abuse, and some have described it as Julia Gillard's gift to the nation. I love seeing her there, flanked by her two female very senior ministers, Jenny Macklin and Nicola Roxon. Its letters patent required it through private sessions and public hearings to bear witness to the abuse and trauma inflicted on children who suffered sexual abuse in an institutional context. It was Australia's longest, most expensive Royal Commission, concluding in December 2017, having cost the Commonwealth over $500 million. I've just got some statistics there. I won't read them all out, but it was big. 5 years, 42,000 calls. The Commission has heard from 17,000 survivors. Most importantly, thinking back to that letters patent, which commissioned it to privately listen to 8,000 individual victims. That was just the six commissioners. There were 57 formal public hearings, which were reported as case studies, and that's really important for our methodology. There were referrals made to authorities, and the report was released at in 2017 or 2018, sorry, and the apology on the 22nd of October 2018. Okay, so the first of my two little case studies, and I'm going to talk to you about that. The first is around the Royal Commission's communicative structure. So I'm honing in, even though we're media researchers, I'm honing in on the Commission itself and its media-related practices. And we asked to what extent was the mediatised conversation of the Child Abuse Royal Commission an exercise in listening to marginalised voices. So just very briefly, because I'll tend to get lost if I spend too much time on this, but I've talked already about publicness, which of course invokes the concept of the public sphere, and this is work that Molly Scudder and Selene and I are doing at the moment, asking whether if through the process of transmission, the Royal Commission became a listening intervention, a forum through which the voices of private citizens, the marginalised, unheard, voices of the victims of child sex abuse could be heard in an empowered space. I could go on about this forever, but our project conceptualises the public sphere not in terms of mass media, but a multimodal network public sphere of public opinion and formation. The second concept is mediatisation, which is a really important key concept in political communication at the moment. Broadly critically analyses the interrelation between changes in the media on the one hand and changes in culture and society on the other. This is really important. I want to know how much inquiries are changing due to the changes in our media environment. We're concerned with how media can no longer be understood as an external influence, but has come to be immersed in every facet of politics and government, embedded in the fabric of policymaking and cultural practice. How institutions like Royal Commissions in many ways become media producers, while still relying on their relationships with journalists and editors. The whole relationship is changing, and it's changing the way our institutions work. And finally, listening. We're conceptually driven by the conceptual framework of listening, which puts the onus on powerful institutions to listen out and respond to marginalised voices. Listening emanates from a rich tradition of participatory, of political participation and social movements theory, and drawing on Caldry, who says, well, voice is undoubtedly a crucial capacity, and this is, this voice listening sort of tension all the way through our research. A voice that is not heard or recognised cannot fully achieve the promise of democratic participation or media justice. So in this project, we're examining the mediated conversation of the Royal Commission in giving voice and improving outcomes for vulnerable groups. So at this stage, we haven't commenced our interviews, but I mentioned before that we were afforded really good access by the chair of the Royal Commission, Justice Peter McCallum, who in kind gave us enabled us to to use their media monitoring. So the Royal Commission monitored the whole 5 years of media coverage. We haven't received the actual news reports. That's research we'll do ourselves, but we did receive the media monitoring. Okay, so through background and archival research of the Commission's website, speeches and media reports, we've identified 5 dimensions of what we refer to as mediatised inquiry practice. The first is leadership, and McClelland's adherence to the principle of open justice, and a commitment to a transparent process that drove the whole culture. And this was from his interactions with the most powerful media editors, to his interactions through social media, and in a groundbreaking sort of way, his making of public speeches, which was the first time that it happened in a Royal Commission. Throughout the Royal Commission, he's demonstrated a capacity to listen and respond, and it was universally agreed that his personal style, sensitive, responsive and outward-looking, set the tone of the Royal Commission. Second dimension, organisational structure, which of course emanates from the leadership. The structure of the Royal Commission put open communication at its heart. A Royal Commission, of course, has an advantage that a court of law or a bureaucracy doesn't have. To use an overly used word, it's a bespoke organisational structure, and we saw that the very structure of the Royal Commission ensured that it was open to listening to the widest range of voices. Media and communication were at the centre of everything it did, to its widest strategies to bear witness and offer redress. Third is media logics, which I won't go into. Fourthly, we looked at social media and digital technologies, which were embraced by the Royal Commission, I would argue, like no other commission had before, and that's also to do with the fact it was very well funded. But using a range of digital tools. Its website became a central portal, and it's now, and it was a living archive as well as its outward face. The Commission live streamed its hearings on its website, meaning that it could be globally received. Online confidential written accounts and the use of social media. Its Facebook page was the flip side of its communication its journalism communication strategy. It enabled it to engage with all of the advocacy organisations who were operating outside. And that brings me to the final dimension, which I refer to as responsiveness. There was an interplay between the private hearings, what the commissioners were listening to, and the public hearings, and it meant that the Commission actually changed its direction a number of times. The interplay between victims, advocacy groups, social media, and the Royal Commission is most strongly exemplified by the Loud Fence advocacy organisation, which pushed very strongly for Cardinal Pell to come to Australia. And I've got this image here. When the Commission then decided to go to Rome instead of when Pell wouldn't come to Australia. These people were crowdsourced to be there and attend, so that's sort of a nice interplay. So just to wrap up this first section, the 5 dimensions of media-related practice enable us to conceptualise the Royal Commission as an exercise in organisational listening. How the Commission played out was the result of a complex interplay of structural, political, institutional, organisational, technological, advocacy and personal leadership factors particular to this moment in time. So we argue that a listening for justice approach enabled the Commission to delve into the silences and shadows, to expose the truth and uphold justice for victims across a wide range of case studies. Okay, so the final thing I want to talk to you about today is a sort of quite a shift. It's a paper that we've got published in the journal Journalism Studies, and it's looking at the media reporting of the Royal Commission rather than the Royal Commission's media activities. So the second case study considers how the Royal Commission was represented in mainstream media and how this enabled or constrained marginalised voices to be heard, voices that were possibly heard during the Royal Commission process. What did the public understand through media reporting? And so I'll talk to you a little bit about the method that we used and the and our findings. So we take a critical media studies position and a listening lens to explore whether the Royal Commission's investigations were amplified evenly by Australia's news media. We asked to what extent was the Royal Commission listening approach reflected or amplified by mainstream media? How much did reporting of elite scandals in the media overshadow Royal Commission cases involving marginalised victims and survivors? And did this overshadowing effect sideline institutional responses designed to prevent child sexual abuse in the future? So again, we draw on the listening framework. I've got a lovely quote there from Stauffer: the injustice of not being heard, even where institutions invite certain forms of testimony. And I suppose that's the underlying argument of this paper, that the Royal Commission itself invited testimony, but how much did Australia's public and the global public, how did they understand that? So in this case study, we draw on the Journalism Studies concepts of news values, which I won't go into, but it's, you know, foundational media studies literature that journalists are driven by an almost implicit set of news values that make one story newsworthy and another not so interesting. Scandal, huge body of literature around scandal and how scandals play out in news media, both for promoting an issue onto the news agenda, but also, what we would argue, overshadowing, and the whole news economy. So a little bit about that more in the paper. Particularly useful was Kate Till's concept of hierarchies of media attention, which helped us to understand how the investigations of the Royal Commission were mediated and the consequences for marginalised voices for public understanding. So what did we do? As I said, we were given all the metadata, all the reports from the Royal Commission's media monitoring company, Isentia, and the only expectation was that we actually acknowledge Isentia as the producers of those reports. So we call this historical source criticism rather than primary. It's a secondary sort of reading of the metadata of the reports that were produced by Isentia, analysing individual news articles. Will come later. We mirrored the method of the Royal Commission by examining its 57 cases, which got the most reporting and which got the least, which received the most sustained attention over time and which did not. We were interested in how the news coverage of the inquiry reflected, amplified, overshadowed, or ignored or sidelined certain voices that had been heard by the inquiry. Okay, so I move now to the data and our analysis. So this graph here is an analysis of the entire coverage of news reports over the 5-year period from September 13 to May 17. So this figure illustrates that media attention to the Commission was sustained over the 5 years of the Royal Commission. It might look like that's going along the bottom there, but it's actually starting at 2,000. Rarely were there less than 2,000 stories a month about the Royal Commission. But the volume of news coverage was uneven, peaking at over 8,000 stories in May 2015 and 10,345 stories in February 16, dropping to 1,000 in the holiday periods of January 2016 and 17. Second figure measures the frequency of case studies mentioned by Isentia as attracting media coverage. This was then mapped against the total volume of news reports to produce the list of the top 5 case studies attracting media attention over time. Case study 28, the Ballarat Catholic Church, had the most sustained media coverage over the longest time frame. This was followed by the Anglican Diocese of Newcastle. The patterns of coverage were then cross-referenced against case studies not highlighted as prominent in Isentia reports. This revealed that certain case studies appeared to have been almost entirely overshadowed by other events related to the Royal Commission as they unfolded. Almost all of the case studies that related to reviews of organisational policies, and I think this is absolutely crucial to remember. The Royal Commission was about institutional responses. Its goal was to try and change institutional practices. The media was not interested in arcane, tedious internal processes, which are the things that might actually change things in the future. I wasn't interested in procedures and regulations that coincided with a strong drop in overall coverage. Peaks in news volume in October 2014 and 2015 provided further evidence of how hierarchies of news media attention operated to overshadow marginalised victim and survivor stories that were deemed less newsworthy than the church scandals. An example is that the hearing about Hillsong Church in Sydney received 3 times the coverage of Beth Carr Children's Home for Aboriginal Children in Brewarrina, outback New South Wales, despite both case studies warranting attention and resources from the commissioners. Other examples include St Anne's Special School in Adelaide, St Joseph's Orphanage in Rockhampton, and the Salvation Army, overshadowed by news media focus on Cardinal George Pell. Our analysis focused on how much this groundbreaking national listening exercise was reflected or amplified by mainstream news coverage. When viewed through the prism of journalism's hierarchies of attention, it's unsurprising that Ballarat, dubbed the epicentre of the Royal Commission in news media and the catastrophic failings of the Catholic Church and its most senior cleric, Cardinal George Pell, attracted the most attention. And this is, I think, what I'm trying to get at. Of course, it's obvious. It's obvious that this would be the biggest story. It was the biggest story, but we're interested in what wasn't talked about. The news economy prioritises elite organisations and individuals. And news values of journalists direct focus towards individual crimes and transgressions rather than structural violence or injustices. Added to that, the Pell story had wide resonance as part of what Swain has referred to as a global chain of inquiry into sexual abuse that has developed over the past 20 years. Scandal demands a narrative that identifies an individual villain who is the cause of a socially significant problem. This is arguably where the Royal Commission's listening for justice practices and news media attention diverge most sharply, as no public space can successfully compete with the media as the ringmaster of scandals, according to Silvio Weisborg. This news media event brought together the most powerful contemporary news values of elites, when Tim mentioned saying, bring him home, celebrity and entertainment, and fused them together in a national scandal frame. Personalisation of the news event is particularly important. This means a focus on people rather than abstract or structural processes. Something that can be pictured in personal terms is more newsworthy than a concept, a process, a generalised or a mass. So we conclude that the overshadowing pattern of news media attention actually works against the Child Abuse Royal Commission's Listening for Justice approach, which delved into the silences and shadows to expose the truth. The inquiry's groundbreaking methodology created possibilities for journalism to continue to attend to institutional responses to child sex abuse beyond the church grounds as it had previously, and to give sustained attention to the most vulnerable victims and survivors. Where the Royal Commission ensured that previously silenced victims were recognised and valued, entrenched news values directed media attention to some of the most powerful and influential voices in Australian society. Our analysis finds that stories of Indigenous, disabled or remote abuse, no matter how heinous, did not fit the scandal frame used to expose rings of pedophile priests or cover-ups of child sexual abuse at some of the nation's wealthiest and most venerated private schools. And we would have seen that on the morning television, Knox College in Sydney getting intense media attention. So I'm just going to conclude now by making a statement that the turn to listening, however, puts the onus on journalists and news organisations to access the interests and claims of communities that have been marginalised. There's little doubt that the Child Abuse Royal Commission was established and operated as an instrument to listen to the voices of the victims of child sexual abuse in institutions. But the news media values and processes represented the situation in quite a different way. So I'm going to finish up there. There's probably quite a lot to take in. I'm very happy to take questions, to explain any facets of the presentation that weren't clear, and just to chat about the project if anyone's interested.